Hello, Pastor Rich here again with more 12-minute mark. Last session we finished chapter 5, and I've been saying that it was the identity of Jesus, his identity and authority that has been established. And remember the disciples, upon Jesus calming the wind and the waves when they're in the boat, they say, "Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him?" And then he goes and meets the demoniac, the Gerasene demoniac, who comes out, and the first thing the demon-possessed man says is, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" So in Mark and irony, it's the demon-possessed man that answers the question of the disciples. And that's the first statement we've had of Jesus, Son of the Most High God, since Mark 1:1. And so it's the demoniac that points out his identity. Now we start to switch themes a little bit. He'll continue to establish his identity. He'll continue to exercise his authority. But we're moving on to this idea of faith and defining faith as we finish out here in Mark, starting on verse 21. And I have a little visual aid here. And you think, well, that looks like your lunch, and indeed it is, but it's also a sandwich. And we're going to encounter our first Markan sandwich today. It is a literary device that writers use where they, and you've been in conversations like this, someone starts a story, and right in the middle of the story, they start to say something else, and they start another story, and then they go back and finish the story. And it can seem like that Mark is sort of rambling, but it isn't rambling. It's a very intentional literary device in which the story that's in the middle is what defines the outside story. The story at the beginning that starts and in the end. It's really what's in the middle that defines it, right? Just like a sandwich. You don't say, "I've got a bread sandwich." They all have bread on them. It's what's in the middle that really defines the kind of sandwich it is. And here we'll see a Markan sandwich of faith. And so you can look at that as how are these stories connected? And in addition to that, it's also a great story of suspense. And so it starts out when Jesus again had crossed over by the lake, a large crowd gathered by the lake. And then one of the rulers of the synagogue, a man named Jairus, came out and fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "Please, come lay your hands on my daughter. She's dying. Lay your hands on her, she'll get well." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and they pressed against him. A woman was there who had been bleeding, subject to bleeding for 12 years. And she had suffered a great deal. She had seen many doctors and she'd spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she got worse. And she thought, if I can just reach out and touch his cloak, I will be healed. And immediately her bleeding stopped. And she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Jesus, realizing that power had gone out from him, turned around and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples said, you see the large crowd pressing around you, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus kept looking around, who had seen who'd done it. The woman, realizing what had happened, went to him, fell at his feet, and told him the whole truth. Trembling with fear, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking to her, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus said to him, "Do not fear, just believe." He took just Peter, James, and John with him and went into the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. There was a commotion going on with people wailing loudly. And he walked in and he said, "What's all the fuss? The girl is not dead, but asleep." And they just laughed at him. Well, he kicked them all out. And then he took just the disciples who were with him and the child's parents into the room where she was. He went to her, took her by the hand, and said, "Talitha kum," which is, "Girl, I say to you, get up." And she got up. And she walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. And he gave them strict orders not to tell anyone about it. But he did say, give her something to eat. Well, that finishes chapter 5. And as we look how this starts out, we have Jesus again. He's going at breakneck speed, and he gets out of the boat, and it's again the crowd. And Jairus, one of the synagogue rulers, a high-ranking Pharisee, most likely comes to him. Typically, when we see the Pharisees, it's always bad news and opposition. There are a couple examples, good examples, of those who were close to Jesus, who were also rulers in the synagogue, Pharisees. This could have even been the Pharisee who maybe had invited him to speak back in chapter 2. But either way, you see he asks Jesus a question, and Jesus is like, well, let's go. And if you put yourself in the situation, especially if you have children and you've got a child who's deathly ill, and the doctor, the physician who you know can heal him, is walking to your house and all of a sudden just stops and says, I think somebody touched me. And asks the question, who touched him? And there's like 1,000 people around. You've got to be thinking, what in the world is going on? Why would he stop? She's on her deathbed. Moments count, seconds count. You have to get to the house to heal her before she dies. You promised you would. But he just stops. He stalls out and he keeps looking around. And then the woman comes forth, this poor lady who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. And this wasn't just a medical condition, that she was also in a state of perpetual ceremonial uncleanliness. And so much like the leper in the leper colony, can't socialize, can't be around. She had to also keep her distance. And the embarrassment of that and the fact that it had took all her money. And so she has suffered a great deal. It gives us quite a bit of detail of her suffering, how long it had been, and how all human measures were dried up in trying to fix this. And Mark's basically making it very clear that there is no human solution to this problem. And she has the faith. She knows that if she just touches him, she doesn't bother him. She's perhaps too embarrassed to ask him. She shouldn't even be in the crowd being ceremonially unclean, but she touches him. And, it's an interesting way to think about it, that she was healed by her own faith as she touches the power of Jesus, even though Jesus doesn't at that moment pronounce her to be healed. This is a unique type of healing. And then, just like the suspense movie, Superman, there's a busload of kids teetering on the bridge, and then there's Lois Lane, she's buried under the rocks, and it's like, who is he going to save? He can maybe only save one. It's one of those kind of stories, and you go to save one, and the other perishes, and it seems that that's what's happened. It plays out like an action movie that, well, the men come from Jairus' house and say, there's no need. Your daughter's already passed away. And you can imagine Jairus just being absolutely crushed and perhaps even feeling betrayed by Jesus, who promised to come here and heal. And yet he's stopped because he was touched by someone else who didn't even bother to introduce themselves at first. And he's having this long conversation. And Jesus just says, he just ignores the death sentence and tells Jairus, you just believe. You just believe. So then they go back to the house, and there's a crowd there that's wailing. These were probably hired mourners. When someone died in the ancient world, there would be professional mourners who would go from house to house. You wouldn't have an obituary. There's no newspapers. But whenever you heard the mourners screaming in a house, someone had died. They likely didn't even know the girl. And so Jesus comes in and says, what's all the commotion? She's just asleep. And these mourners just crack up. They think that's funny because, again, they probably didn't know the girl anyway. They're not family. And Jesus kicks them out of the house, and just takes Peter, James, and John and the parents to the room. And then reaches out, raises the girl, and here we've seen exorcism power, we've seen healing power, we've seen then cosmic power with the wind and the waves, and now the power over death. And she gets up, walks around. He wants this quiet. He doesn't want this type of message spread yet. He will show his power over death, broadcast that in a different way. So they're going to keep that quiet for now. But what we see here in the sandwich is that the story of the woman being healed is she becomes the model of faith. It's kind of like the guys that tore the roof down. It's like anything I can do to get to Jesus. That seems to be the bold faith that Jesus is really honoring here. It's the boldness of faith. The fact that she would reach out and grab him. The fact that they would tear down the roof. And Jairus, the irony is that she's an unnamed, unclean woman, and here he is, one of the rulers of the synagogue. He's a bigwig in the religion, and that she becomes the model of faith for him. And that's what we see, that it's all a sandwich about faith, about a boldness of faith, and that his faith is then rewarded there at the end. And so Jesus exercises that, and saying Talitha kum, which Jesus typically would speak in Aramaic, but our Bible is written in Greek. And Mark's gospel was primarily written to Greek-speaking people. So whenever he quotes Jesus directly in Aramaic, he then gives us a little translation. That will happen half a dozen times or so. Talitha kum, which is Aramaic, girl, get up. And she walks around and says, well, make sure you get her something to eat. That's our 12-minute mark for this time. I'll see you tomorrow for chapter 6. God bless.